This is an introduction to McCay, Chapter 19, Revolutions in Politics, covering the period from 1775 through 1815. Now, you'll notice right off the bat that this is a shorter time frame than any of our previous chapters. What we're going to do here is slow down chronologically and dive into the details of these 40 years to really look at these revolutions. And when I say these revolutions, there's really one star, which is the French Revolution, which is the center of this chapter and a terribly important period of history. Now, it's during this period, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, that we see what we come to call the dual revolutions. The dual revolutions are, on the one hand, the French Revolution, the political revolution, and then on the other hand, the Industrial Revolution, which is going to be the economic consequence. Those two late 18th century revolutions are going to shape the 19th century and shape the world up to today, really. So I confess right up front that Chapter 19 is one of my very favorites. I love the French Revolution. I find it endlessly fascinating and rewarding for examination. We're going to do some really fun stuff with the French Rev, and I really look forward to going through this material with you. Okay, so what are the big questions of this unit? Okay, so the basic. Why does the revolution happen? Why do we see these wave of revolutions happening at this time? What causes it? What's special about the end of the 18th century that we should see all this? Why didn't the revolutions occur 100 years earlier? Or why not 100 years later? Why now? Then as we get into the details of the French Revolution itself, you're going to have to ask yourself, why doesn't the revolution stop in 1791? Because in 1791, it seems like the things that the revolutionaries want, a constitutional government, a limit on the monarchy, a reform of certain financial systems, it seems like they've gotten everything that they want. When the American Revolution gets to this point, it stops. The French Revolution keeps going. Why? We're going to spend a lot of time in this chapter on violence and on violence within the revolutions. And one of the recurring questions about this is going to be, was the violence of the French Revolution and of the terror, was that inevitable? Was that baked into the ideology of the revolution? Was any revolution that was based on these ideas going to turn violent? Or was the violence circumstantial? Could the violence have been avoided if only other things had happened? It's a really interesting and controversial argument. Then we'll turn to Napoleon. Was Napoleon the fulfillment of the revolution, or was he the rejection of it? We'll get into this later in the text, but essentially you can argue that Napoleon was the consequence of the trends of the revolution, and therefore fulfilled many of them, the Enlightenment, centralization, things like that. Or you can argue that Napoleon essentially betrayed the revolution, gave up its greatest ideals, and was nothing more than another enlightened absolutist who was seeking his own glory. And then finally, we'll sort of try and step back and say, how do we connect these revolutions, the American, the French, and the Haitian revolutions, and try and make sense of this period? So that is our structure. Those are our questions that we're going to have to bear in mind as we move through this very detailed material. So the first section is just background to the French Revolution. What were the factors that led to these revolutions in the late 18th century? And here we're talking primarily about what we call the ancien regime, the old order, the order that precedes the French Revolution. What was society, government like during this period, and why does it set up the revolutions? Then, perhaps slightly incongruously, you have a small section on American history. a few pages on the American Revolutionary Era from 1775 to 1789. And the question McCay asks is, why and how did American colonists forge a new independent nation? Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on American history. You'll get plenty of that next year. But American history in this context does influence Europe and vice versa. So a little bit of time and attention on what's going on in the U.S. and how does the American story reflect European interests is a useful thing and will set you up well when you take U.S. next year. Then you'll move into the revolution itself. The revolution in France, first part, 1789 to 1791. And this is what I would often call the hero story of the French Revolution. This is the part of the French Revolution the French love to celebrate. And the question that McCay puts here is, how did the events of 1789 result in a constitutional monarchy in France? What were the consequences? So this is where you'll get things like the fall of the Bastille, the Women's March on Versailles, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. This is the good stuff. This is where the Enlightenment really takes hold of French government and really tries to make it better. And so that this hero story will set us up as we move forward. And there's a wonderful and very important primary source written by this guy. It is Abbé Sieyès' What is the Third Estate? One of the most famous and influential political pamphlets in European history, and very much worth your time. He will ask, what is the Third Estate? He'll give an answer, and it's really on point in the terms of summarizing what the early part of the revolution was about. Then we'll have a rather long and glorious class simulation of 1791 and what happens in 1791 as a consequence of these heroic events. Then McCay turns to the next piece of the story, which he calls World War and Republic in France, 1791 to 1799. And this is where it turns dark. This is where the hero story goes away. And the question that McCay asks is, why and how did the French Revolution take a radical turn, entailing terror at home and war with European powers? And so here's where you get the story of the great French Revolutionary Wars, where France is going to end up fighting essentially every other country in Europe. This is where you see the terror with the execution of the king and then the queen and Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety and all of the awful bloody excesses of this period. It's a dark, dramatic story which McCay will try and lay out for you. And this is where you really need to say, well, was this inevitable? Was this necessary? It's during this period that you're going to see French society change in rather dramatic ways. And there's a nice section that McCay has called A Revolution of Culture and Daily Life. The French Revolution is perhaps the first of the wars which has a really dramatic impact down to the societal level and to the changing way people live. And so you see things like a new revolutionary calendar. The calendar is completely redone. The 12-month Christian calendar that we are familiar with, gone. Playing cards are changed. Everything about society is impacted by this revolution. And so McCay gives you a nice little slice of that. Then we turn to the Napoleonic Era. After a period of somewhat corrupt government known as the Directory, in 1799, Napoleon takes over. And the question that McCay tees up for us here is, well, why does Napoleon assume control of France and then much of Europe? And then what factors lead to his downfall? You could argue that McCay doesn't spend enough time on Napoleon. On the one hand, Napoleon is one of the most fascinating and influential figures in all of world history, never mind European history. On the other hand, you could also argue that he's really just a sort of a speed bump on the way to the 19th century and modern Europe. So you'll probably end up feeling like there's not enough Napoleon or too much, but we'll try and figure him out as best we can. Then the last section of this chapter is the Haitian Revolution, which, even though it's in the Caribbean, is very much part of European history. This is a revolution you may not be familiar with. It's a time in which the slave colony of Haiti declares its independence and then wins its independence in the first really truly successful slave revolt in human history. And it's a rather dramatic and complicated story. The great hero of this period is Toussaint Louverture, and this is his portrait. The question that McCay tears up here is, how does the slave revolt on colonial Saint-Domingue lead to the creation of the independent nation of Haiti in 1804, which is a fairly straightforward how and what question. We'll also dip into the consequences of the Haitian Revolution and why and how we see it as a part of this entire revolutionary era. All right, it's a huge amount to cover. It's incredibly deep and fascinating, and I think we're going to have a great time with it. I'll see you in class.